What happens when faith meets real life, with all its messiness, divisions, and contradictions? What does it look like to follow Jesus in a culture shaped by pride, power, and personal freedom? The book of 1 Corinthians speaks directly into those questions. Written to a divided and struggling church, it shows how the gospel reshapes everyday life, relationships, morality, and community. In this video, we'll explore 1 Corinthians and see how God calls imperfect people to live faithfully in an imperfect world. Overview. 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth, a city known for wealth, diversity, and moral excess. Corinth was a major commercial hub, filled with competing philosophies, religious practices, and social divisions. The church there reflected its environment. Believers struggled with pride, division, sexual immorality, misuse of spiritual gifts, and confusion about worship and doctrine. Paul writes not to condemn, but to correct and restore. From the opening chapter, he addresses divisions within the church. People were aligning themselves with leaders rather than with Christ. Paul responds by pointing them back to the cross. Human wisdom, status, and eloquence mean nothing compared to the message of Christ crucified. As the letter unfolds, Paul tackles practical and uncomfortable issues head-on. He addresses sexual ethics, lawsuits among believers, marriage, food sacrificed to idols, worship practices, and spiritual gifts. Throughout it all, Paul emphasizes that freedom in Christ is not about self-indulgence, but about love, responsibility, and building one another up. At the heart of the letter is a call to live differently. The gospel is not just something to believe. It is something that reshapes how believers treat one another and how they reflect Christ in the world. Historical and social setting. Corinth was a city obsessed with status, public image, and personal success. Public speaking skills, philosophical sophistication, and social rank carried immense value. This cultural mindset influenced the church, leading believers to compete for recognition and spiritual importance. Religious life in Corinth was also complex. Pagan temples, rituals, and moral permissiveness were common. New believers struggled to separate their former way of life from their new identity in Christ. Paul writes into this tension, reminding the church that following Jesus means adopting a new set of values. The wisdom of God often looks foolish to the world, but it leads to true life. Key themes in 1 Corinthians. Unity in Christ. Paul calls the church to reject divisions and remember that all believers belong to Christ. Unity is grounded in the cross, not personal preference or leadership loyalty. Wisdom versus worldliness. Human wisdom prioritizes power and prestige. God's wisdom is revealed through humility, sacrifice, and the cross. Holiness and responsibility. Grace does not excuse harmful behavior. Paul calls believers to live morally and responsibly, reflecting God's character. Christian freedom guided by love. Believers are free in Christ, but that freedom must be exercised with care for others. Love limits freedom for the sake of community. Worship and spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts are meant to serve the church, not elevate individuals. Order, humility, and love are central to worship. Love is the highest calling. 1 Corinthians 13 stands at the center of the letter, declaring that love surpasses all gifts, knowledge, and achievements. The resurrection hope. Paul concludes by affirming the resurrection of Jesus and the future resurrection of believers. Without resurrection, faith is empty. With it, hope is secure. Key verses in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 18, the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27, God chooses what is weak to shame the strong. 1 Corinthians 6 verses 19 to 20, believers are called to honor God with their bodies. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 31, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 12 verse 12, the church is one body with many members. 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 to 7, love defined through patience, kindness, and humility. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 20, Christ has been raised, the foundation of hope. Relevance Today. 1 Corinthians feels strikingly modern. Churches today still wrestle with division, pride, moral confusion, and misuse of freedom. Paul's message reminds believers that faith is lived out in everyday decisions, relationships, and community life. The letter challenges individualism. It calls believers to think beyond personal rights and preferences and consider how actions affect others. It also offers hope, reminding us that transformation is possible through the power of Christ. In a culture that celebrates self-expression above all else, 1 Corinthians calls for self-giving love rooted in the gospel. Closing thought. 1 Corinthians shows us that faith does not remove us from the challenges of life, but it reshapes how we face them. The cross redefines wisdom, love redefines strength, and the resurrection redefines hope. Paul's message is clear: live not for yourself, but for Christ and for one another. And when love leads the way, the church becomes a powerful witness in a broken world.